Dean Carney is a man living in Las Vegas, and he was born into a middle-class family. Even so, his parents tried to give the best for his education. One of them is to send him to Harvard High School, which is an elite school for the rich. At the school he met a student named Joe who went to school there because he got a scholarship. Even though they both come from middle-class families, they both have different characters. Dean is more sociable as well as smart to win the hearts of all his friends who are children of rich people. Meanwhile, Joe is more alone. In July 1983, or 6 years after graduating, Dean came to a cafe to sell his friend luxury car, named Kyle's. Coincidentally, Joe was also there. They both meet and tell each other about their lives. Dean lives the same life as before, which is to survive by taking advantage of all his friends and the rich people around him. Meanwhile, Joe works as a salesman in a stock selling company with not much salary. It's not that Joe doesn't want to own his own business and improve his life, but he doesn't have many relationships or the money to invest in the stocks he is into. After hearing that, Dean suddenly had an idea to get Joe to cooperate. Dean felt confident that they would both be successful because he had many rich acquaintances whom Joe could later invite to invest. As a first step, Dean invites Joe to come to Charlie's birthday party tonight. Charlie was one of their old high school friends, and Dean hoped that Joe could ask him to become an investor. At first, Joe wasn't sure if Charlie would invest in him, because back in high school, Charlie and his friends often bullied him. But finally Joe agrees after Dean convinces him that Joe has potential and that this is a great opportunity for Joe to take. And when he got to the party, Joe looked totally blown away by the rich kids partying at Beverly Hills, especially seeing Dean, who is familiar with everyone including a woman named Shim Evans. However, Joe was ignored when he tried to shake hands to introduce himself to her. Not long after that, the two of them met up with Charlie and his friends, the Biltmore brothers, Kyle and Scott. It didn't take long for Joe to present his gold stock investment business. However, Charlie immediately interrupted Joe's conversation, and he said that his father was also a gold businessman and he knew that the price of gold would soon fall. Then, Kyle begins to realize that Joe is his lousy high school friend. In the end, the presentation failed. Joe returns home with nothing and he feels pessimistic about being able to run a business with Dean. However, there is a magazine that tells the success story of Steve Jobs which later inspired him. And without wasting any time, that night Joe came up with a strategy and a new mindset. He would no longer offer Charlie an advantage, but rather recognition or self-respect. Because Joe knew they were rich kids wouldn't care about investment techniques. Dean thought that would make sense, and he immediately gave him $10,000 as initial capital, which he admitted was an apology money from Kyle. He hoped Joe could double it to $20,000 so Charlie and his friends would be willing to join in on the investment. Then Joe invested the money in a gold stock, and luckily in 3 weeks they both made a 35% profit. Every day Joe always keeps an eye on market developments, until the day when they will tell the success to Charlie and his friends. While they were on their way, before reaching Charlie's house, Dean stopped by to deliver an order for expensive wheels belonging to a rich man named Ron Levin. Ron is a former stock player now retired and in the business of managing every tender for the rich. After getting acquainted, Joe took the time to read the stock news in today's paper. Instantly, he felt shocked when he read that gold stocks had experienced a very significant decline. Ron, who had worked at a stockbroker, immediately guessed that Joe had suffered a loss. Joe shied away from it and he tried to be calm and said the stock had been withdrawn since yesterday. Upon arriving at Charlie's house, Joe informs Dean that they have lost 50% and he plans to return the remaining $5,000 to Kyle. Dean was naturally shocked when he heard the news, and he honestly said that the money wasn't apology money but money from selling Kyle's car that he hadn't given Kyle. The two of them had an argument and Dean was adamant that the presentation had to go on because this was an opportunity that couldn't possibly come a second time. When everyone had gathered, Dean opened his presentation, while Joe thought as he looked at his record of losses. And that's moment Joe bravely took a big risk. He takes the idea to lie to Charlie and his friends by turning losses into gains. Joe confidently introduces his business and offers a great opportunity to become someone beyond their father's control and at the same time known for his own success. They were offered to be the main investors for Joe's new company called BBC, a company that would venture into the world of stocks or any business that could generate a lot of money. As evidence, Joe gave Kyle a check for $5,000 which Joe recognized as investment gain. Meanwhile, the remaining $10,000 are still kept intact in the form of gold stocks. Kyle was shocked because the money from the sale of his car was used without permission. But because he was already tempted by the check, he finally didn't mind it. He even invited Joe to eat together tonight. Before leaving, Joe asked Dean if they had to be willing to invest at all costs so the money could be used to buy stocks to cover the losses. In the evening they went to Spago, an elite restaurant in Beverly Hills. This time, Dean did most of the talking and he tries to influence by instilling the idea that Joe is a man with the potential to find profitable opportunities. In the midst of that conversation, suddenly a waiter came and gave expensive wine. Turns out the wine was a gift from Ron who happened to be there. Joe immediately greeted him along with Dean. There, Ron was having dinner with an artist named Andy Warhol. After a short conversation, Andy gave Joe his autograph on the candy bar and Joe accepted it gladly. Meanwhile, Kyle and Scott are getting excited about getting into the BBC business. They think that without risk and hard work they can get 50% profit in just 3 weeks. Finally, before going home, each of them invested a check for $80,000 in Joe, and Joe will use the investment money to take advantage of the growing automotive market. He struck a deal with an acquaintance to buy a luxury car from Germany for $10,000, which he then resold for $80,000. Kyle, Scott and Charlie were the first three to experience the car before it was brought to the dealership. Meanwhile, Joe takes one of the cars to Ron's house to show that his BBC is growing and he hoped that Ron would invest in him. But after arriving there, Ron was less interested even though Joe had explained how much profit he made from the automotive business. Ron thought that Joe's business was still relatively small and he would invest if Joe could make hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. At that time, Ron also told about his experience about why he quit the stock world. It turns out Ron had a problem with SEC, but luckily Ron didn't get the law because what he did was not prohibited by law. Over time, BBC became more developed because now, Scott, Charlie and Kyle joined the sales team that invites new people to invest. The person they invited was certainly not an ordinary person. They are old players in the business world who are not easy to persuade. But when they saw the profits that were made very quickly, finally one by one they started to dare to invest.
Alright, I'm in.
Families who were titans of the West.
Some of the money was used to build a luxurious office to make it more convincing. Then Ron came to tell that he was going to invest in gold stocks along with BBC. Even so, he still uses his own broker, so BBC only certifies his investment, and later if he makes a profit then the profits will be divided. Right then, Joe contacts Ron's broker named Frank to check BBC's current account. Joe couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he immediately loaded the speakerphone. They were all shocked when they heard that the total of BBC's accounts reached $4 million. Ron immediately hung up and reminded them to be careful in using the money. Not long after, one of their investors named Dexter got his first 50% profit. Dexter, who initially lacked confidence in investing, finally admitted that BBC was the safest place to invest. Then he tore up his profits and handed him a new check for $167,000. The money is all savings for old age and tuition for his 4 children. That money became a huge responsibility and made Joe nervous, and he almost returned the money. He was worried because the bigger money, the bigger profit. Dean again reminded Joe that if the check was returned it would all be over because the money would be used to pay the investors. While Joe always promises a profit of 50% every 3 weeks to all his investors.
He pays off both the mortgages and sends every kid to grad school.
The next day Joe accidentally met Sydney, a woman who had ignored him at the party. This time, Joe bravely got acquainted and chatted so that the two of them became closer and they told each other about their lives. From there, Sydney invited Joe to see her senior artist exhibition tonight. And without thinking, Joe accepted the invitation. It was because he didn't want appearance to disappoint, so he bought an expensive suit and made his father wonder where he could get that kind of money. Then Joe explained that his business was now progressing and in fact he was planning that he would soon buy a new house. However, his father was worried and said that no honest business was successful in an instant. Unlike the excited Joe, Sydney was scolded by her boss because she was considered to have been careless at work. After knowing this, Joe tried to comfort her and continued by inviting Sydney to solve the problem she was facing. That night they became closer until they finally formed a relationship. Joe was more excited because a few days later he and Dean were planning to sign a deal worth $250 million. He intends to pay off the $3 million owed by a coal company called Cogenco Energy with the money Ron has invested in BBC. To be seen as an important person, he hires a bodyguard named Tim. Before he left for Chicago, he attended a discussion forum with the entire company staff including Cogenco Energy shareholders. Upon arriving there, Joe presented about BBC's intention to cover all of Cogenco Energy's debts and get the company back on its feet. On the night of the meeting, Joe managed to attract the attention of the shareholders, so that they agreed and in return Cogenco Energy would merge to become part of the BBC.
Right now, we'll make you rich. The choice is yours.
It's worth $250 million.
A few weeks later, after the deal with Cogenco Energy was successful, Joe intended to buy a luxury house while Dean was worried because until now no investors have come in. While this week they have to pay profits to all their old investors. Joe responded casually and he thought this week Ron would transfer gold stock profits through his broker, because last week gold experienced an increase. Not only that, which makes Joe feel calm because he is sure that soon their agreement with Cogenco Energy will be formalized and there will be money coming in from the shareholders. Finally, Dean forgot about his worries because now he too was enjoying the comforts of the luxurious house. Then Joe invited Sydney to live there and the house was also used as a place to gather and celebrate Christmas together. Everyone seemed happy to enjoy the excitement of the party being held. But behind that, no one knows that Joe is starting to find it difficult to pay profits for investors. Turns out Ron hadn't sent the BBC share yet. And when pressed, Ron simply replied that he had ordered his broker to send the money to the BBC account. That night, Charlie, Kyle and Scott urged Joe to immediately pay the disbursement of their father's profits. Joe immediately diverted it by giving his 3 friends $500,000 in stock so that they forgot about the bill for a moment.
500.
At the same time, Ron also gave Joe and Dean a Rolex branded watch to congratulate them on their continued development. They both looked very happy and they continued the Christmas party until morning. Anything that is run with bad things will sooner or later turn around. And this is where Joe got his revenge for his actions. On Monday morning, Joe called Frank and he asked about the disbursement of the profits from Ron. But Frank instead asked if the call was part of the script or not. Joe confused, and it was revealed that Ron had been deceiving him all along. The investment money that Frank was reporting at the time was only part of a narrative because Ron confessed to Frank that he was a journalist who was making news about the company at BBC. Frank is asked to pretend to be a stockbroker. And the most devious thing was that he covered the amount of BBC shares that Ron used to borrow money from the bank for $1.5 million. Joe and the rest of his team really feel cheated, as another fact also comes to light that Ron is actually under triple state surveillance for bank breaches, theft, check fraud, and money order fraud. Joe is very angry with Sydney, because without Ron's money the deal with Cogeco Energy will be cancelled. And that means BBC doesn't have the funds anymore to pay all investors' profits. Joe revealed that he trusted Ron a lot and he was very happy to get a Rolex watch, which he thought was the best gift he had ever received. However, Joe is fooled when Sydney knows that a genuine Rolex watch does not make a sound when the seconds are ticking. Sydney tries to calm Joe down by taking him on vacation to another city, but Joe refuses. Either way, he must be responsible and try to pay off all the investors' money. Joe, Dean, Charlie, Kyle and Scott finally get together and they begin plotting revenge against Ron. Dean thinks it's time to teach a lesson, because Ron is a con man who is unlikely to report to the police. Charlie, Kyle and Scott were also supportive. In fact, one by one they revealed how they were going to torture Ron to their satisfaction, which Joe wrote down on a piece of paper. In the evening, Joe and Tim prepare to come to Ron's house. Before entering, Joe reminded Tim not to hesitate to beat Ron until he actually handed over the money. Then Joe came in and admitted that he was being chased by investors. Not long after that, Tim arrived and Joe immediately asked for the money Ron had borrowed from the bank in BBC's name. Ron, who was starting to panic, sent Joe upstairs to write his own check. After Ron signed the check, Joe immediately ordered Tim to take off his mask. As soon as he saw Tim, Ron burst out laughing because he didn't expect that he had been held up by Tim, who used to be a doorman. Ron started talking casually. He says that Joe is a person with bad taste for hiring Tim, who is a black slave. Those words offended not only Joe, but also Tim, who shot Ron in the head straight away. In the midst of the panic, Joe goes to Dean and he tells him what happened. Joe was really freaking out and Dean tried to calm him down by telling him Ron deserved it. In addition, Dean also provides a solution. If anyone asks about Ron, just say that he is going to New York to visit the Cogeco Energy Company. Right on June 6, 1984, Tim and Joe went to Soledad Canyon, a valley in Los Angeles, to dispose of Ron's body. Before they left, they made sure that his body was not recognized by pouring acid all over his body. During the day when the check was trying to be cashed, it was rejected and Dean was even more worried because if BBC really went bankrupt, then SEC and tax authorities would come to investigate. And they were able to find Ron's name and get the FBI to step in on the search. Even so, Joe and his friends are still trying to maintain BBC by meeting an acquaintance of Charlie's named Izzy. Izzy promises to invest $1 million as long as Joe and his friends help to smuggle his father into LA. Turns out, Izzy's father is a troubled man in Iran and his overseas accounts are frozen. So the only way is to take him to LA and later the money will be dispersed with the help of a friend. On July 30, 1984, Joe and Dean began smuggling using a large chest. But when everything was ready, Izzy's father refused because he was not willing if he had to go in and stay in the crate during the trip. Dean gets emotional and plans to force Izzy's dad because he's upset. He had already spent a lot of money to prepare the whole plan. Luckily, Izzy's father suddenly passed out after using too much opium. And without thinking, they immediately put him in a crate to be immediately taken to LA using a car box. The long journey didn't even make Izzy's father aware. When he arrived at his destination, even Dean thought that Izzy's father had died. Luckily, when checked, Izzy's father's pulse was still throbbing and Tim thought he had just overdosed. While waiting for Izzy's father to wake up, Joe meets Sydney to ask her to flight to another city. However, this time Sydney refused because tonight she was going to show off her work and she couldn't just leave her big opportunity behind. They both argued fiercely, even though Joe had explained the various problems he was facing. It doesn't stop there. There are already many investors in the office who have asked for all their investment money to be returned. Kyle and Scott, who could not stand it, chose to leave the company and just left. Meanwhile, Dean is still looking after Izzy's father, who is still unconscious. Unexpectedly, when Dean was smoking, Izzy's father woke up and immediately attacked. Dean almost died, but luckily Joe arrived just in time. The fighting stopped and Joe immediately tried to find a rope to tie Izzy's father so he wouldn't rebel again. At that time, unexpectedly, Izzy's father tried to reach the phone for help. So Dean, who was there at that time, without thinking immediately strangled him to death. Dean and Joe immediately discuss how to faking the death of Izzy's father, because no one would believe him if he died of an overdose. Dean suggests throwing him in the desert and putting his cremation in to hand over to Izzy. That's moment Joe felt that everything was getting out of control and he intended to end and admit his mistake. But Dean refuses because he thinks Joe has wasted everything that has been built so far. Joe finally follows Dean's advice, but after disposing of Izzy's father's body, he insists that when the money is out he will return all the investors' money and quit for good. That night, Joe returned to his father's house and with all his embarrassment, he asked his father for help to be a witness for the disbursement of Izzy's father's check. Joe didn't say much. He just said that what his father had said all along was true, and Joe wanted to end it all. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Dean, who looks so confused, even argues with Sydney, because Dean is under the influence of drugs, so he accidentally mentions Ron's name, which makes Sydney suspicious and asks where Ron has been all this time. Not only that, his actions, even all his words, became out of control and hurt Sydney's. So she decided to get out of the house. 2 days later, when Joe and Izzy were trying to cash the check, the police suddenly came to arrest Joe on murder charges. Joe at that time just resigned, while his father also could do nothing, but his dad say that he would hire the best lawyer to release him. Turns out it all started with Sydney and Dean's argument that happened last night. Sydney, who felt hurt, then reported Dean, and after being investigated, then everything was exposed. Not only BBC as a con man stock company, but the murders of Ron and Izzy's dad. Dean is the main witness in each of these cases, and he tells the chronology. However, not with the murder he committed. Actually, Dean is a person who has the nature of being good at talking, good at getting along, and good at taking advantage of other people. At the company, he confesses that he is just an ordinary worker, while for the murders of Ron and Izzy's father, he alleges that Joe is the culprit. He tells about the list of revenge plans that Joe wrote at the time, which was the idea of all of them, including Dean. In the murder case against Izzy's father, Dean admits that it is both kidnapping and extortion. He explained to investigators that he had tried to help him by punching holes in the wooden crate, so Izzy's father wouldn't run out of air. Dean managed to play his role very convincingly. So when it was linked to all the evidence obtained, the police believed and determined Joe as the mastermind behind the fraud as well as the murderer. Eventually Dean was allowed to leave and asked to come to court to retell from the beginning. Meanwhile, Joe could only stare in disappointment that his best friend had betrayed him. So far, Dean has succeeded in using Joe for his ambition to become a respected person, because he has the principle that money is a benchmark for how people perceive him.